Hello everybody, welcome back to American Textbook Reading. I'm Brian Stuart, and in this lesson we're going over Social Studies Book 4, Lesson 14, getting near the end of the book. And Lesson 14, the subject is various landforms. So we will discover what are some different types of landforms and what are some landforms in the U.S. The U.S., of course, is the United States. Oh, and by the way, of course, the picture that you can see for this is of the Grand Canyon. And actually, I grew up not my entire childhood, but some of my childhood, I grew up in Arizona, and my parents live there now, and it's not far to go to the Grand Canyon, and it's a very impressive sight, and that is a type of landform. If you get a chance to go, I would recommend it. It's really amazing. Okay, anyway, let's continue. As usual, we start with the vocabulary, and we have the first word here, landform, right? I mentioned that in the introduction of this lesson. What is a landform? Well, of course, it has two words. Two words were combined to make one word, and we know what land is. Land, of course, is the earth. You know, you look around, you see the land. Form, of course, means shape. So the land has many different shapes, right? It's a shape on the surface of the earth. And of course, we can see that. You look around, you can see mountains. Well, that's a shape of the land. That's a particular shape of the land. That's a landform. Sometimes you see even if it's just very flat, we call those plains, right? And that is another type of landform. So there are many different landforms. Let's take a look. So the next word is stretch. Stretch means to reach out. And the reason we're looking at this word here is because, like I just said, you know, sometimes you have plains, that's a landform. But if you look out across these plains, the land seems to stretch out forever, right? It's to reach out. To stretch is like to reach out. I'm stretching. Of course, you might stretch in the morning. Oh, you're right. You reach out with your arms and your feet, your hands and your feet, and you stretch your body, right? Well, stretch out means just to reach out. It also means to like to pull or to go on forever. It seems to stretch out. And that's what this picture shows us. The land is stretching out all the way to the horizon. This is, I should just mention this, that's an H, horizon. Teaching you a new word here. Horizon is where the land meets the sky, right? That's the horizon. So the land stretches out to the horizon. Okay. Next word we talked about this already, mountain. Now I said mountain, but we can also add another word, mountain range. So what's the difference between mountain and mountain range? Well, if you just say, look at the mountain over there, it might just be one mountain. Just, you know, there's a plain, then boom, there's a mountain, but it's all by itself. It's like the Lonely Mountain from J.R.R. Tolkien's Hobbit, okay? Just one mountain sitting out there. But if the mountain is not alone, if there's a lot of mountains and they're all in a row, right? They all seem to be on a line, and there's another mountain, a bunch of mountains behind those, we call those mountain ranges. So a mountain range is a series of mountains. It's not just one mountain, it's many mountains next to each other, and they're all connected, right? You know, you might have a mountain, which is the peak, but you still have high land connecting it to the next mountain, and that is a mountain range. And in the world, there are many famous and very big, very long mountain ranges. Gulf. A gulf is another type of landform, even though we're talking about water, but it's still, you know, it's a shape of the land and the water. A gulf is an area of water that is partly surrounded. That's important. By land. It's partly, because if it was completely surrounded, it would be a lake or it would be a sea, right? Not an ocean. An ocean is not completely surrounded by land. An ocean surrounds the land. But if the land surrounds the body of water, it's either, like I said, it could be a pond, a small lake, or it could be a sea, right? So in this case, we're looking at the Gulf of Mexico, which is a famous gulf. You have America up here. This is Texas, it goes along in the southern states over here to Florida. And then, of course, we have Mexico coming down here, and the rest is Central America, but it's open. You can't see the rest of the map. It's open to the Atlantic Ocean. So the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic Ocean, there's no land between them. So it's not a sea, right? It's a gulf, okay? And of course, you can see over here, the Gulf of California. It's very similar, right? Because Baja California comes down here. This is Mexico, of course. And then Mexico, the rest of Mexico is over here. And you have some ocean that opens up into the Pacific Ocean. It's not completely surrounded. It's open to a larger body of water. So we call it a gulf, okay? So that's a gulf. Located. Now, in the previous lesson, we talked about locations, right? And of course, location is a noun. Located, where is it located? That describes where something exists or where it is, right? Not where it is being, but where it exists or where it is in a certain place, okay? So we use a sentence, where is it located? Where is the Gulf of Mexico located? Okay, south of America, east of Mexico. That is where it is located. So where is it located? Where is it? Okay, good. Next, peninsula. Now, peninsula is an interesting landform, right? There are many countries that are peninsulas. There are some states that are peninsulas. By the way, I always have a little hard time with the spelling of peninsula. And let me give you a little tip here. Sometimes I think, is it P-E-N-N? I want to put N-N or S-S. I was thinking, is it that way? No, just remember with peninsula, it's 1-1-1, okay? So if you get confused, you think, should I put two N's or two S's? No. It's 1-1-1, okay? Peninsula. One N, then one N, then one S. Not two N's together, right? They're separated. So peninsula. And pronunciation, peninsula. Peninsula, of course, it's like the opposite of a gulf. Okay? Think about it. It's an area of land that has water around three sides. Not completely surrounded, right? A gulf is not completely surrounded by land. A peninsula is not completely surrounded by water. It's connected to a larger body of land. Take, for example, the Korean peninsula, very famous peninsula, right? So you have a peninsula, but it's not completely surrounded. It's not the Korean island, right? No, it's not an island, it's a peninsula because it's connected to the rest of Asia, right? There you can walk. You don't have to cross any water to go from Korea to China to Russia, right? It's all land, right? But Korea is surrounded on three sides by water. That makes it a peninsula. The state of Florida in America, you look at a map of America, you see the state of Florida sticking down on the east coast, and that is another peninsula surrounded by the Atlantic Sea and the Gulf of Mexico on the west side and the Atlantic on the east side. And the Gulf of Mexico comes around the south as well. So those are peninsulas, okay? That's like the opposite of a gulf, okay? Trace. Trace means to follow something. And you probably know this word from art class, right? Sometimes if you have a picture, you say, oh, that's a cool picture. I want to draw it. So you put a piece of paper, thin paper, so you can see the image underneath. And what do? You draw the outline of, I don't know what I'm drawing here. Oh, there we go. Okay, I got it. You draw that's a horrible heart. I didn't know where I was going. Okay, so you just trace the object underneath the paper, and that's tracing. So to trace means to follow something. So you're following, the other hearts on the piece of paper. That's a little bit better. But anyway, this is also tracing. This guy here looks like a detective. He's tracing the footprints to find out who stole his cookie. Okay, so there's a cookie jar back here that's turned over, and there's lots of cookies on the floor, and one of them's eaten. Okay, so he's tracing to find out who ate my cookie. So he's tracing the footsteps. Okay, so to trace means to follow something. Okay, those are our words for the lesson. Okay, let's take a look at the first main idea in this lesson, and of course we're talking about landforms. In the vocabulary section, we talked about a few different landforms. Let's take a look at some more. Well, first of all, let's start at the top and go around like a clock. That's a good logical way to look at a diagram like this. Of course, in the middle we have landforms, and these are different types of landforms. Now, we already talked about peninsula, and I gave you the example of the state of Florida. Now, not the entire state of Florida is a peninsula, right? Over here, this is not a peninsula. Actually, people call this, that's an interesting geographical feature, but of course it's made by people, it's not made by nature. But you see this little piece of land here? It's kind of stretching out and connects to the rest of the state. We call that a panhandle. And Oklahoma is another state, sits above Texas. It also has a panhandle. And Texas has a panhandle at the top on the west side. It also has a piece of it that kind of sticks up from the rest of the state. We call those things panhandles. So if you're talking about Florida, you can say, I live in the panhandle of Florida. That means that the person lives somewhere in the area that I'm circling here. If they live in the peninsula, then they live somewhere along here. So panhandle is another word you can use. But anyway, peninsula, we talked about it. It's surrounded on three sides by water. It's the opposite of a gulf, right? That's a peninsula. Another landform, of course, is a valley, and that is between two mountains or mountain ranges. You have a valley, and of course, water usually comes down there. You usually have a river or a stream at the bottom of a valley. Not always, but usually we will have a valley. Next, we have a hill. And a hill, of course, is a small mountain. It's a mountain wannabe. Okay, maybe. But a hill is easy to climb over, right? Well, some hills are easy to climb over. Some hills are more difficult. But hills are not as big as a mountain. It's like, think of a hill as a baby mountain, right? That's an easy way to think about what is a hill. Okay? Next, we have island, and I mentioned that when I was talking about peninsula, because a peninsula is surrounded on three sides by water, but it's still connected to the main landmass. But an island is completely surrounded by water. If you want to get off the island, at some point you have to cross water to get off the island. Okay, next we have mountain. And of course, we talked about mountains before. You could have one single mountain, or you could have a mountain range, right? Many different mountains that are connected. And so you have mountain or mountain range. And of course, we also talked about plain, especially when we talked about stretch, right? Plains stretch out for forever. It seems like forever, but they're for a very long ways, all the way to the horizon, as far as you can see. That's how far the plain stretches. And by the way, when I see this, I think of the plains of Texas. I'll give you a little story. One day, a long time ago, my brother and I were driving to see our sister who lived in Dallas, Texas. And we drove across Texas. And we drove from New Mexico. Oh my gosh. It was a very, very difficult trip because we were driving in a Jeep. We had the top off, so the sun was on us. And we're driving through Texas, and it kind of looks like this, except it's worse than this. There's just dirt. And then the only thing that grew were these oil rigs. And I'm just kidding, they weren't growing. But it looked like they were the only vegetation, just oil rigs as far as you could see everywhere. And you're just driving for hours and hours, and the sun's coming down. We're like, where are we? This is a very difficult drive. But Texas is a huge state. It would take you all day to drive from one end of the state to the next, maybe a day and a half, right? It's a huge state. Anyway, so that reminded me of Texas there. Okay, so those are different types of landforms. Now, landforms in the U.S., right? What are some different landforms in the U.S.? Again, remember in the previous lesson, I taught you guys about key. A key shows you either a symbol or a color in this case, and what that color represents or what that symbol represents. In this case, we're not talking about symbols like we did in the last lesson. We're looking at colors. So you can also use colors in a key to show different things on your map. In this case, the color purple shows us where the mountains are. And if you see these mountain range, this is a mountain range. You see how long it is. It extends for hundreds of miles or hundreds of kilometers. And this is the Appalachian Range on the East Coast. I've never been there. I would like to go there. It's a very beautiful area. I understand from pictures and from movies too. The Last of the Mohicans was filmed in the Appalachian Range. Now, of course, many people know about the Rocky Mountains, and the Rocky Mountains aren't just in America, they also extend far into Canada. And this over here, this is the coastal range for mountains. I mean, it's not all mountains, there are some plains there, but these are famous or major mountain ranges in America, okay? Now, highlands, of course, are like, they're flat, but they're high plateaus. And of course, you'll find those are near mountains. You find the plateaus here by the Appalachian Mountains. You do have some plateaus right here in the middle, but this is also very famous, this high plateau. We call it the high plateau area. It's also called the Great Intermountain, what is it called? The Intermountain Plateau, or the Great Basin. It's also called the Great Basin. And it's a very high area. Even though it's flat, it's high in elevation because it's between two mountain ranges. The land has been pushed up there. So even if you're living on a plain, your elevation, the distance between sea level and where you are is quite great. So there's a lot of high deserts and a lot of high plains in this area. Now, plains, of course, they might be a little bit lower. Plains are basically here, and I'm thinking about the Great Plains. That's the yellow part. The Great Plains are play an important part in American history because they are the areas of America that are very flat. And a long time ago, huge herds of buffalo would migrate back and forth along these plains. You know, as winter came, they went south, and then as it got warmer, they went back north, and they would eat the grass, and the Indians would hunt them. And the Indians who lived in this area and hunted the buffalo, they were called the Great Plains Indians, and there were a lot of them. And so, you know, America has a lot of plains in the middle, a lot of farming area in the middle, very good farming land. America grows a lot of crops, and mostly in what we call the heartland, or the middle of America. Then you have mountain ranges on the west and a mountain range on the east. Okay. Let's do the reading, and as usual, I will read it out loud. You guys repeat after me, either out loud or in your head, and focus on the vocabulary that we went over so far, and also see if you can pick up some new words. Okay, let's begin. You guys ready? Let's start. You can see many different natural features, such as mountains, on the Earth's surface. They are called landforms. The landforms in North America change from place to place. In central North America, the Great Plains stretch out for thousands of miles. To the west of the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountain ranges reach up to the sky. And that's true. I'll give you another story. One time I was driving from the Great Plains towards Colorado. I was coming from Kansas, and I was driving towards Colorado. And of course, it's plains. The land rises a little bit, but at a certain point, you see something in the distance. You say, what are those things? And they get larger and larger and larger. And like, oh my gosh, those are mountains. That's a mountain range. That's the Rocky Mountain range, and it's very impressive. It's very amazing because you're driving and it's just flat, and all of a sudden this huge mountain range shows up in front of you. And so to the west of the Great Plains, the Rocky Mountain ranges reach up to the sky. It's like they're reaching up and they're going to grab the sky. That's how tall they are. It's a very impressive sight. Okay. Travel further west and you come to a large body of water called the Pacific Ocean. If you trace your finger down the map, you will come to the Gulf of Mexico. I did this, I have to interrupt here for a second. If you trace your finger down the map along the Pacific coast, you won't come to the Gulf of Mexico, but if you jump over Mexico, then you will come to the Gulf of Mexico. So be careful. I got confused there the first time I read that. So you go over Mexico. Okay, let's continue. The Gulf of Mexico is located between the United States and Mexico, the south coast of the United States and the east coast of Mexico. East of the Gulf of Mexico is the Florida Peninsula. This is a large body of land sticking out of the North American continent. The North American continent has many different kinds of landforms. Okay, many different kinds of landforms as we discussed so far in the lesson. Mountain ranges, plains, highlands, valleys, all sorts of different types of landforms. Okay, that's the reading. Let's take a look at how the information is organized. Okay, let's take a look at how this information in the reading passage was organized. Here we have main idea and details. Now, of course, I've said this many times. When you do this, you have a main idea. It's a general statement. It's a broad statement that you make, and then you have details that support it. In this case, we have 1, 2, 3 details, actually 4 details, because the third box has 2 examples. But anyway, we have 4 details. Let's just put another mark there. So we have 4 details that support the main idea. What is the main idea? The main idea is the North American continent has different kinds of what? Well, of course, in this lesson, we've been talking about landforms. So different kinds of landforms. And more than one, there's many different kinds of landforms. What are they? Well, let's look at the details. The first example of a landform in the North American continent. Oh, by the way, the North American continent, we're not just talking about America, we're also talking about Canada as well. So that's an important point, obviously. So what is the first detail? The first detail is the great beep are in central North America. Now the great what? Remember when I talked about this, I gave the example of the buffalo, right? The great herds of buffalo and also the Native Americans who would travel with the buffalo and hunt them. And they were called the Great Beep Indians. What is the blank? The Great Plains. So in this case, we're just talking about the landform, so don't write Indians. The Great Plains are in central North America. So those are the Great Plains. And of course, nowadays, it's an area of a lot of agriculture. A lot of food is grown in the Great Plains. So the Rocky Beep are to the west of the Great Plains. So if we're in the Great Plains and we go to the west, we see this landform rising up out of the earth, rising up huge, like it's reaching up to grab the sky. As I said before, this is very impressive. What am I talking about? The Rocky Mountain Ranges. The Rocky Mountain Ranges, the Rocky Mountains. Some very popular songs have been written about the Rocky Mountains. And in this case, the Rocky Mountain Ranges, that's what it said in the reading passage. And it's not just one mountain. It's a range of mountains. It's many mountains connected to each other, and they stretch not only across America, but also into Canada as well. Thousands of miles, a very impressive, very major feature of the North American continent is the Rocky Mountains. You find some very, very tall mountains in the Rocky Mountains. Some very impressive scenery as well. Okay, moving on. What's the next detail? The next detail is the Beep of Mexico is located between the U.S. and Mexico. Now, what were we talking about, right? Between the south coast of America and the east coast of Mexico, but not surrounded by land, right? It's open. So what do we call that? We call that the Gulf. So the Gulf of Mexico is located between the U.S. and Mexico. It's not surrounded by land, right? It's open to the Atlantic Ocean and the Caribbean. The Caribbean is a sea, but the Caribbean isn't completely surrounded by land either, but we do call it the Caribbean Sea. So that's interesting. Anyway, the Gulf of Mexico is located between the U.S. and Mexico. That's the next example. Then we have one more. Like I said, there's 4 details that support the main idea because east of what is it? The Gulf of Mexico. East of the Gulf of Mexico, you have this land sticking out. Now, this land sticking out is not completely surrounded by water. So it's kind of, like I said, it's the opposite of a gulf, right? It's land that sticks out into water, surrounded on 3 sides. We call that, of course, a peninsula. How do we spell peninsula? Do you remember? Is it 2 N's or 1 N? It's 1 N, but then we have an I and another N. Is it 2 S's or 1 S? It's 1 S. S-U-L-A. Sorry, my S doesn't look very, it looks like a G. Okay, there we go, that's an S. S. Okay, so it's a little difficult to pronounce maybe. Peninsula. Peninsula. Okay, so the Florida Peninsula. And it's kind of interesting when you think about it. Peninsula is kind of the opposite of what a gulf is. Peninsula is land, a gulf is water. A peninsula is surrounded on three sides by water. A gulf is surrounded on three sides by land. Interesting. Okay. So our lesson is about various landforms, not just, of course, in America or the North American continent, but all over the world. Think about the country in which you live. What are the amazing landforms in your country? Are there great plains? Are there mountain ranges? Do you live on a peninsula? Is there a gulf nearby? Interesting things to think about. Okay, well, I hope you learned a lot in this lesson, not just vocabulary, but also some interesting ideas. When you go out, when you take a trip, take a look around, see what kind of various landforms you can see. Okay, well, we'll see you in the next lesson. Take care, everybody. Thanks for studying with me.